The morning sun cast a golden light over the hills as Tom saddled Blaze his steadfast chestnut stallion. The dew sparkled on the grass and the early air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of the fields. This was his sanctuary far from the chaos of the outside world. As Tom adjusted Blaze's bridle, he felt a familiar ache that mornings often brought. Years had passed since he'd lost his wife and son, and though the pain had dulled, the emptiness lingered. Blaze was one of the few creatures he trusted. Ed, with that part of himself, a calm presence that seemed to understand without words. "Ready, boy," he murmured, patting Blaze's neck. The horse stamped his hooves impatiently, tossing his head as if eager to be off. Tom chuckled softly. Blaze was spirited today, and he had a feeling the stallion had a purpose in mind, one Tom didn't yet understand. They set off along the narrow trail winding through the woods and into the foothills. The rhythmic clip-clop of Blaze's hooves and the distant calls of songbirds filled the air, grounding Tom in the peace of his land. The trail led toward a rocky outcropping, a place Tom had passed 100 times, where boulders jutted out, creating natural pockets and shadows. As they neared the familiar spot, Blaze began to slow, his ears pricked forward, posture tense. He stopped abruptly in front of a dark opening in the rock, a cave half hidden by vines and loose stones. Blaze let out a low, uneasy whinny, his entire body stiff as if he'd sensed something inside. "What's got you spooked, Blaze?" Tom muttered, his pulse quickening. Blaze's usual calm had given way to a strange agitation, his nostrils flaring as he stared at the cave. Tom glanced at the shadowed entrance, noting broken twigs and a few disturbed rocks near the mouth. He hesitated. The cave had always been empty as far as he knew, but today it felt as though something was watching him from inside, an unfamiliar presence that sent a shiver down his spine. Blaze whined again, louder this time, his gaze fixed on Tom, almost as if urging him forward. Reluctantly, Tom swung down from the saddle and secured Blaze to a nearby tree. Blaze stamped his hooves, snorting, his eyes sharp with an intensity Tom had never seen before. "So all right," he said, picking up his flashlight from his saddle bag. "I'll take a look." He gave Blaze one last reassuring pat and stepped toward the cave. Inside, the air was damp and cool, carrying a faint metallic tang. Tom's flashlight cut a thin beam through the darkness, illuminating jagged rock walls and scattered leaves on the cave floor. The silence was deep, pressing against him as he moved further in. Then the beam landed on something unexpected, a small bundle slumped against the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. Tom's breath caught as he approached. He saw her, a young woman, her face pale, clothes disheveled and lying crumpled on the ground. In her arms she cradled a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. Whimpering softly against her chest, the woman's face was drawn and gaunt, her cheeks hollowed and her closed eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. She looked as if she'd been there for days, hanging on with sheer willpower alone. Tom knelt beside her, his mind racing. Gently he touched her shoulder. "Mom, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low and calm. There was no response. Her breathing was faint but steady, though her skin was cold to the touch. The baby stirred, letting out a soft, desperate cry, snapping Tom back into action. He had no idea who she was or how she'd ended up here, but that hardly mattered now. With great care he lifted the woman into his arms, cradling her head. Her baby nestled between them. Her body was lighter than he'd expected, worryingly so, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Holding her close, he carefully maneuvered out of the cave and back into the sunlight, where Blaze waited, eyes watching Tom as though he understood the gravity of the situation. "All right, Blaze," Tom murmured, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "How found them? Let's get them to safety." He mounted Blaze with practiced ease, balancing the woman and her baby in his arms as best as he could. Blaze took to the trail with a smooth, urgent pace, seeming to know the importance of his mission. Each jolt and bump on the path made Tom wince, worried for the fragile lives in his arms, but Blaze carried them with a sure-footedness Tom hadn't seen before. His stride steady and unwavering as they covered the distance to town. Minutes later they reached the hospital, and Tom dismounted quickly, carrying mother and child to the front doors. Nurses and doctors rushed out, their faces a mixture of surprise and alarm as they took in the sight of the exhausted woman and her Crying infant Tom explained what little he knew, barely able to piece together the words as he recounted finding her in the cave. They whisked the mother and child inside, disappearing down the corridor as Tom stood alone, his hands still trembling from the urgency of it all. As the doors swung shut, he turned back to Blay, who was waiting nearby, quiet and still, watching him with his wise dark eyes. For a brief moment Tom felt an overwhelming gratitude for the horse who had led him there, who had sensed something he hadn't. Just then a police officer approached, his notebook in hand. "Sir, I'll need a few details about what happened," he said, glancing curiously at Blay and then back at Tom. Tom nodded, answering as best he could, though his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman and her baby, now in the hands of strangers somewhere beyond those hospital doors. He didn't know their story, but he felt a strange sense of responsibility, as if finding them was no accident. When the officer finished his questions, Tom looked back at Blay, who seemed to have softened, his eyes no longer holding the fierce urgency from earlier. It was as if Blaze knew his job was done, and as Tom stroked his man, he couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter with the woman and her baby had set something in motion, something neither of them could yet understand. Tom couldn't keep his mind off the young woman and her baby. In the days that followed, every day after finishing his farm work, he made his way back to the hospital, asking about their condition. Eventually the staff began to share small pieces of her story. Her name was Maria. They told him she had come to the United States from Brazil alone and pregnant, clinging to the hope of a new start, but instead of opportunity she found only hardship and fear. One evening, as the nurse gave him a few more details, Tom's heart ached. Maria had been living on scraps, avoiding anyone who might question her and hiding wherever she could find shelter. The cave was a last resort, a refuge that nearly cost her everything. Tom felt his chest tightened with a mixture of sorrow and anger. He knew what it felt like to lose everything and be forced to start over. After his own family tragedy, he had shut himself off from the world, finding comfort only in the routine of the land and the quiet companionship of Blaze. Moved by Maria's story, Tom found himself returning to the hospital with a proposal. He knocked lightly on her door and entered to find her sitting up, looking stronger but still frail. Her baby Emma lay nestled in her arms. Watching him with wide, curious eyes, Maria looked at him with surprise, her eyes filled with caution. "Hello, Maria," he began, removing his hat and nodding respectfully. "I'm Tom. I'm the one who found you out there." Maria's gaze softened, though she was visibly tense. "Thank you, Tom," she said softly, her English laced with a thick accent, "for helping us. I don't know what would have happened." Tom waved off her gratitude gently. "I'm just glad we got to you in time," he replied. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking again. "Look, I don't know what kind of work you've done before, but I have a farm nearby. It's not much, but it's honest work, and you'd have a safe place to stay if you're interested. You and Emma would be welcome there." Maria blinked in surprise, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. "You would do that for us? But you don't know me," she murmured, clutching Emma closer. Her weariness was clear, her posture still guarded, but her voice was laced with something Tom recognized: hope, tentative and fragile. Tom nodded, of offing a gentle smile. "Blaze there seemed to think you two were worth the trouble," he said, trying to lighten the moment. "Besides, no one should have to go through what you have, especially not a mother and her child." For the first time Maria's face softened, and she gave him a faint smile. "Thank you, Tom. I don't know what to say. We've had no one since we got here." Tom simply nodded. "Then consider this a fresh start." A few days later, Maria and Emma arrived at the farm. Tom noticed Maria's unease as she settled in. Her movements were cautious, her eyes often darting toward the road as if expecting someone to come for her at any moment. It was clear she was haunted by the fear of being discovered. Tom sensed her reluctance to trust him fully, and though he wanted to reassure her, he gave her the space to adjust at her own pace. Her gratitude was evident in the way she threw herself into the work, helping with the animals and learning the ropes of life on the farm. As the days passed, Tom began to notice the gentle bond forming between Blaze and Maria. The horse seemed drawn to her, often approaching her with a soft nicker as she worked in the barn. At first she was hesitant, but with time she grew comfortable, finding solace in Blaze's calm presence. Blaze had a way of lowering his head beside her, almost like a silent gesture of comfort, and Maria seemed to find strength in those quiet moments. Emma too had taken to Blaze, toddling up to him whenever they were in the barn. Blaze would lower his nose carefully, allowing Emma's tiny hands to explore his soft muzzle, his patience unwavering despite the sense of peace that began to grow. Maria's fear lingered. Tom noticed the way her hands trembled slightly whenever they heard a car passing, and her cautious glances toward the road. Her immigration status weighed on her, and though Tom tried to ease her worries, he understood her fear all too well. The small town could be quick to judge, and it wasn't long before whispers about the new woman at Tom's farm began to circulate. Some neighbors were curious, others wary. Tom brushed off the gossip, but he knew the situation was fragile. The real test came one evening when a neighbor, Mr. Allen, approached Tom in town. Allen, a blunt, grizzled man known for his strict views, didn't bother with pleasantries. "I've been hearing about that foreign girl you got over at your place," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "You don't know what kind of trouble you're inviting in, Tom. Folks like her, they come here with nothing and just expect us to pick up the pieces." Tom clenched his fists, but he kept his voice calm. "She's not here for a handout, Allen. She's working just like any of us, and she's got a baby to care for. I'm just giving her a fair chance." Allen scoffed. Allen shaking his head. "Fair chance or not, Tom, people are talking. They'll come around soon enough, and when they do, I hope you're ready for it." Tom watched Allen walk away, his words hanging heavy in the air. He knew that offering Maria a place at the farm wasn't something the town would easily accept, but he was resolute. Maria had been dealt a rough hand, but she was determined, and that was something he respected. That night, as Tom worked alone in the barn, he noticed Maria standing by Blaze's stall, lost in thought as she gently brushed his man. She didn't notice him watching, and for a moment he saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the weariness of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. It was the look of someone who had nearly given up, but hadn't. Without thinking, he approached her. "It's been hard, hasn't it?" He asked softly, his voice carrying a warmth that caught her attention. She looked up, her eyes glassy, and nodded. "I came here for a chance, but it's like no matter where I go, there's always something trying to push us back." She took a shaky breath. "Emma deserves better than this constant fear." Tom placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice firm. "As long as you're here, I'll make sure you're safe. We'll face whatever comes together." For a moment she was silent, but he saw something shift in her expression, a tiny flicker of trust, a fragile acceptance. She glanced back at Blaze, who stood quietly beside her, almost like a watchful guardian. As she met Tom's gaze again, there was a trace of gratitude in her eyes, and a hope he hadn't seen before. But just as Maria opened her mouth to respond, a car's headlights appeared in the distance, illuminating the farmhouse in a harsh white glow. Tom's heart sank as he recognized the sheriff vehicle pulling up the driveway, the engine rumbling as it came to a stop. "Stay here," he murmured to Maria, feeling her tense up beside him. "I'll go see what he wants." With a sense of dread gnawing at him, Tom stepped outside to meet the sheriff. The weight of everything they tried to protect hanging in the balance. Tom's heart pounded as he walked toward the sheriff's car, its headlights casting long harsh shadows across the yard. Sheriff Wills, a tall weathered man with a stern gaze, stepped out, nodding curtly as he approached. "Evening, Tom," the sheriff greeted him, his tone calm but laced with tension. "Evening, Sheriff," Tom replied, keeping his voice steady. "What brings you out here?" The sheriff looked past Tom toward the barn where Maria and Emma were standing in the dim light, watching anxiously. His gaze lingered, his expression softening briefly before returning to a practiced neutrality. "Folks around town have been asking questions," he said, "about the young woman staying with you. They're concerned about you know who she might be and her situation." Tom clenched his jaw, feeling The weight of every word, she's just a mother trying to take care of her baby. Sheriff, she's not hurting anyone. The sheriff let out a slow sigh, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Tom, I know you mean well and I'm not here to make trouble for you or for her, but you know how these things go. If people start calling in complaints or reporting her status, there's not much I can do to keep immigration from getting involved. Tom nodded, forcing himself to stay calm. I appreciate the heads up, Sheriff, he said, though every word was strained, but as long as I have a say, she's staying right here. Sheriff Wills hesitated, his face softening. Just be careful, Tom, he said quietly before turning back to his car. Tom watched as the sheriff's tail lights faded down the gravel road, the uneasy silence settling around him after the sheriff's visit. Life on the farm grew tense. Tom tried to carry on as usual, but he was more vigilant, watching every car that passed, noting every neighbor who seemed to linger a little too long near his property. He could see the fear weighing on Maria too. Her hands trembled slightly whenever a car slowed near the farm, and her once tentative glimmers of hope began to fade back into the shadows. Despite the tension, Maria continued to work tirelessly around the farm. She kept a close bond with Blaze, who seemed to sense her unease and offered silent comfort. The horse would nuzzle her shoulder gently as she fed him or worked in the barn, his calm presence grounding her in moments of doubt. Emma adored Blaze too, and Tom often found her laughing as she patted his nose, a small flicker of joy that seemed to temporarily wash away Maria's worry. Tom's resolve grew stronger each time he saw Maria and Emma with Blaze, watching the gentle way they connected with his beloved horse. Blaze had brought them to him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all for a reason. He decided that he needed to do something more. The risk of losing them was one he couldn't bear. The next day, Tom reached out to a local immigration support organization he'd heard about in town. He arranged a quiet meeting with a volunteer, hoping they could help Maria start a path toward legal status. It was risky. If anyone caught wind of his involvement, it could draw unwanted attention to the farm, but for Tom, the thought of standing idly by while Maria lived in constant fear was simply unacceptable. When he returned to the farm that evening, he found Maria brushing Blaze's man, her face thoughtful, though there was a lingering sadness in her eyes. He approached, carrying a sheath of papers. I met with some folks who can help, he told her, handing over the papers. It's a long process, but it's a start. They'll work with us on a case for asylum. Maria looked down at the papers, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over her face. Tom, I don't even know what to say, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You've done so much already. I can't let you risk. Maria, he interrupted gently. I've made up my mind. I want you and Emma to have a real chance here. He paused, a rare vulnerability softening his voice. You two, you've brought something back into my life that I thought was gone. You don't have to go through this alone. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, a small smile breaking through the worry etched into her face. For the first time in weeks, Tom felt a surge of hope, as if they'd finally found a foothold in their uphill battle. But that hope was short-lived. A few days later, as Tom was finishing his evening chores, he noticed a black car parked along the road just outside the property line. He recognized the sleek, official-looking vehicle. It was Agent Lockwood, the immigration officer he'd heard about from the sheriff. The man was standing by the fence, his gaze fixed on the farmhouse, his posture rigid and unreadable. With a sinking feeling, Tom approached him, his hands clenched at his sides. Agent Lockwood, what can I do for you? The agent's expression was unreadable, his voice cool and professional. Mr. Jenkins, we've received multiple calls regarding a foreign national living on your property. We need to ask you a few questions about her status. Tom fought to keep his voice steady, though his frustration was simmering just beneath the surface. Maria is just trying to keep her daughter safe, he replied firmly. She's not breaking any laws. Agent Lockwood's gaze sharpened, his tone growing colder. Harboring an undocumented immigrant is a serious offense, Mr. Jenkins. I'm advising you to think Carefully before you interfere with an official investigation. Tom's jaw clenched, but he met the agent gaze without backing down. All I'm doing is giving her a fair chance, he said, his voice unwavering. Everyone deserves that. Agent Lockwood seemed to study him for a moment, then glanced back at the house. If she's undocumented, there are procedures we have to follow, but he hesitated. Briefly, something shifting in his expression. If her situation is as you say, I'll recommend that her case be reviewed with consideration. Tom nodded, relief tinged with apprehension. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. That's all I'm asking for, Agent Lockwood. Just a chance. The agent gave a curt nod, then handed Tom his card. If anything changes, I'll be back, he said before turning and walking back to his car. As the car pulled away, Tom felt a mixture of relief and dread. He knew the process would be long and there were no promises, but he was more determined than ever to see it through, no matter the cost. When he returned to the farmhouse, he found Maria sitting by the window, clutching Emma tightly. She looked up, her face pale and anxious, her gaze locked on his as he entered. They know about us, don't they? She whispered. Tom nodded, his voice calm but resolute. Yes, but we're not giving up. There's a long road ahead, but we're going to walk it together. You and are safe here as long as I can help it. She managed a small tremulous smile, though he could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. I'm sorry, Tom, I never wanted to bring this kind of trouble to you. He shook his head, his expression softening. It's not trouble, it's the right thing to do. You two belong here now. As the night settled around them, Tom sat in silence beside Maria, sharing the weight of uncertainty, yet resolute in his promise to stand by her side come what may. The days that followed were tense, each one stretching longer than the last, as Tom, Maria, and Emma waited in a kind of quiet limbo. The weight of their situation hung over the farm, casting a shadow over their daily routines. Tom kept in touch with the immigration support group and their lawyer, gathering every document he could, while Maria worked tirelessly, almost as if she could keep her fears at bay by throwing herself into the farm work. One morning, just as Tom was finishing his coffee, he heard Blaze whinny from the field, the sound urgent and sharp. Tom looked out the window to see a line of cars pulling up the dirt road. At the front was a familiar black sedan. Agent Lockwood's. Realizing what this meant, Tom's heart pounded. He ran out to the barn where Maria was feeding Blaze, who had grown visibly attached to her over the past few weeks. She looked up as Tom approached, her face growing pale as she saw the line of cars in the distance. Tom, are they here for us? She asked, clutching Emma tightly to her chest. Tom placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Maybe, but we're not alone in this. He looked over his shoulder toward the road where a few of the farm's neighbors had already gathered, drawn by the sight of the approaching cars. Mrs. Carson, the elderly widow who'd known Tom since he was a boy, stepped forward, her eyes sharp with defiance as the cars parked. Agent Lockwood stepped out, his gaze shifting between Tom, Maria, and the small group of neighbors forming around them. Sheriff Wills followed along with a few officers. Lockwood's face remained impassive, but Tom thought he detected a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Tom stepped forward, his stance resolute. Agent Lockwood, Sheriff, we know why you're here. But before you say anything, I want you to know Maria's story. He turned to Mrs. Carson and nodded, signaling her to speak. Tom here has always been a good man, Mrs. Carson began, her voice steady, and if he says that this young woman deserves a chance, then I trust him. She cast a defiant look at Lockwood. I've lived here my whole life and I've seen good people struggle. We stand by Tom and by Maria. Several neighbors murmured their agreement, standing in silent solidarity behind her. Even Sheriff Wills looked conflicted, his expression softening as he glanced at Emma, who clung to her mother's skirt. Lockwood raised his hand, his voice firm. This isn't about choosing sides, folks. The law is clear. But as he looked around, his voice faltered slightly. That said, I can recommend that her case be reviewed with some leniency given the community support. But if this goes forward, we'll need to see tangible proof that she's taking steps toward legal status. Tom seized on this opening, pulling out a folder with the documents They'd prepared. We've already started the process, he said, handing the papers to Lockwood. Maria's applying for asylum. All we're asking for is a chance for her case to be heard. Lockwood glanced at the papers, his expression unreadable. These things don't get resolved overnight, he said, though his voice had lost its earlier edge, but I'll do what I can to keep this from escalating for now. Tom exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. That's all we need, a chance. After a tense moment, Lockwood gave a curt nod, signaling his officers to return to the vehicles. Sheriff Wills approached Tom, a faint smile on his lips. Good luck, Tom, he said quietly, tipping his hat before heading back to his car. As the cars pulled away, the neighbors let out a collective sigh, some of them clapping Tom on the shoulder, offering quiet words of encouragement. Tom turned to Maria, who was watching in silent awe, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. The following months were a mix of hope and uncertainty. Tom, Maria, and the immigration lawyer worked closely, submitting every form and document needed to support her case. The small community rallied around them, holding fundraisers to cover legal fees, and Maria began to integrate herself more fully into their lives, offering help to those who had once viewed her with suspicion. One evening, after a long day of work, Tom and Maria sat together on the porch, watching Emma toddle toward Blaze in the field. Blaze lowered his head, gently letting the little girl pat his nose, his calm demeanor a comfort to her, as if he understood the role he played in bringing this family together. As the stars began to appear overhead, Maria turned to Tom, her face soft with gratitude. I don't know what we would have done without you, Tom, she whispered. You gave us a home when we had no one. Tom looked at her, his own eyes bright with emotion. You don't owe me anything, Maria. You and Emma, you brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost forever. He paused, choosing his words carefully. After losing my family, I thought I'd never have a reason to hope again, but now having you both here, it feels like this place has life in it again. They sat in silence for a while, both absorbed in the quiet peace that had become rare in recent months. Tom felt a sense of wholeness he hadn't known in years, as if the empty spaces in his heart were finally healing. He realized in that moment that Maria and Emma were more than just his guests, they were his family. A few weeks later, they received word from the lawyer that Maria's case would go before a judge, giving her a fair chance to argue her case for asylum. Though the journey was far from over, the prospect of legal recognition gave them all a sense of cautious optimism. On the day of the hearing, Tom accompanied Maria to the courthouse, standing by her side as they waited for her name to be called. As she clutched Emma's hand, Maria felt Tom's steady presence beside her, a reminder that she was no longer alone. The hearing itself was a blur, filled with questions, testimonies, and legal jargon that seemed to stretch on for hours, but at the end of it, the judge ruled to give her temporary status, granting her the right to remain in the country while her case was processed further. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a monumental step forward. When they returned to the farm, the neighbors gathered to celebrate, welcoming Maria and Emma as if they had always belonged there. Tom watched as Blaze trotted over to where Maria stood, his large dark eyes reflecting the glow of the evening sky. The horse lowered his head beside her, letting her rest her hand against his warm coat, and for a moment it felt as though he too understood the significance of the day. As the celebration quieted, Tom found himself sitting on the porch again, watching Emma play by the fence as Maria laughed with Mrs. Carson and a few other neighbors. He felt a wave of contentment settle over him, a deep sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Blaze wandered over, nudging Tom's shoulder as if seeking his own quiet acknowledgement of the journey they'd all taken together. Tom chuckled, patting the horse's neck. You knew, didn't you, old boy? He murmured. You knew all along, as he looked out at Maria, Emma, and the community that had formed around them. Tom realized that his life had come full circle. In the most unexpected way, he had found family again. One that in some mysterious way Blaze had led him to. Under the vast starlit sky he felt a warmth he hadn't known since his loss, and as he watched Blaze settle beside Emma. Tom knew that no matter what lay ahead they would face it together, bound by hope, resilience and unbreakable trust that had brought them this far.